Welcome back to the second panel of the day. We're really excited about this panel. This is something a little different. It's kind of a panel where we're announcing a new initiative that we're doing at IGMAP with some external partners. So it's not the official launch of this new project, but it's kind of announcing the launch and also serving as a kind of crowdsourcing for us to talk to this, to bring this group of amazing people together, but also all of you and all of your expertise to think about what would be most useful, or what could this project do to be useful that isn't being done already, so that we are helping to improve the work of the global atrocity prevention community of policymakers, practitioners, and scholars. So this new initiative that we're launching is called the PREVENT Project, and PREVENT is an acronym. I'll explain that a little later. But this is really at its core a collaboration between IGMAP and also the Ohio State University, really with Holly Neiseth-Gutierrez, who is our main collaborator on this, as well as several different external governmental and civil society partners. And the idea for over the last 30 plus years, the practice of trying to forecast and predict atrocity violence and also assess and understand what are the underlying risk factors, structural and otherwise, that most paved the way for this violence to happen. This has been a practice that really started in the 90s and now has grown into this full-fledged thing where the problems we have are not predicting where atrocities are likely to occur. The problems we have are generating the political will and energy, and also figuring out how do we best respond to prevent them from actually occurring. And that's thanks to the work of a lot of the people on this panel and in this room. This particular project, the PREVENT Project, emerged from directly out of several things, but primarily among them is the disbanding of the US government's atrocity prevention institutional infrastructure, and particularly one part of that was called the Political Instability Task Force, which is a task force that Holly served on and many other amazing people that provided non-public atrocity forecasts to the US government in past administrations. This government doesn't seem to care about that. Our goal with this is to build upon the successes of both past and current models, both private models that haven't been made public, and I just want to say from the beginning, our idea is to make this as public and transparent as possible, like the Political Instability Task Force, but also public models that have really been leaders in this field, including the Atrocity Forecasting Project out of Australia National University and the Early Warning Project that's still really a leader produced by the Simon Scott Center at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and really Ben Valentino is really the initial brains behind that operation. So we're very happy to have him here to talk about that. But these different models that have been developed to assess risk for atrocities, particularly group-based violence, so we can talk about, and Holly will mention how we're trying to also extend beyond that to think about more indiscriminate targeting of civilians as well. The idea with this project is to start with quantitative analysis by producing an annual forecast for likely atrocities over the next several years, but also to do more than that, because there are already models that are doing that work, and we don't want to just duplicate what they're doing, of course. It's called the PREVENT Project because PREVENT is a mnemonic that we've developed for the 7 categories of risk that we're assessing through this model. So that's the P is prior atrocities, the R is regime upheaval, the E is executive overreach and non-democratic governance, the V is volatility in the economy and the environment, the E is exclusion and social fragmentation, N, neighboring instability and other international factors, and the T are threats to those in power and triggers. What this mnemonic also reveals is another important component of the project, which is that we want to move beyond just providing this quantitative assessment or list of potential places where atrocities are going to occur, and also focus on providing tools for state and non-state actors to use that information to do preventive work and develop preventive policies and programs. That means we've also developed, so Holly and I worked on developing a toolkit so that based on that global quantitative information, we can also do country level and subnational, really deep qualitative assessment of where these risk factors lie, who are the potential perpetrators and victims in different contexts, and what does the network of potential stakeholders that can be involved in preventive work look like? And importantly, that's extending way beyond just the national and international systems, but also thinking about the role of civil society, of local governments, of traditional and religious leaders, of the media, journalists, and all of these different actors who are often excluded when we're talking about what prevention policy and practice looks like. We're going to be producing annual case studies where we're trying to look at that quantitative information and also delve more into specific case studies to see why and what we can learn by looking at these individual cases by doing qualitative assessment as well. In particular, we're going to be focusing on producing case studies on not just on countries that are at the highest level of risk, because there are plenty of case studies on those, but rather countries that see really drastic increases or decreases in risk in relatively short windows of time. So we can try to see what are driving those increases or decreases and what can we learn from them for developing preventive policy. We want to look at countries that remain at relatively high levels of risk but don't actually experience atrocities to see what we can learn there. And also countries that are kind of outliers and that are driving the model in weird ways, and to see what we can learn from those as well. Holly can talk a lot more about this. We also have some governmental partners that are using this as a resource, and they're already in the place of reaching out to us and asking them to develop case studies for them using this PREVENT framework to see, to assess like country level case studies and what they can do. Beyond simply assessing risk though, we also want to look at and provide more evidence into the tools of prevention and which ones are most successful and in which contexts. So we're also working on developing a global map of preventive policy and programs to look at the vast scale of how governments and civil society actors at all levels, international, regional, national, and local, are responding to these risks in a way that mitigates those risks, that builds societal resilience, that protects and safeguards the rights of victim communities or potential victim communities, and that deters potential perpetrators of violence. So we're going to be having a publicly accessible map of all of these different preventive policies. And at IGMAP, generally, we think about prevention in a really broad scale, right? So we're not just talking about responsive prevention when atrocities are already taking place, but also thinking really proactively or regressively. Finally, before I turn things over to Holly and then start the conversation with the future panelists, the other panelists, we also hope to analyze from year to year the successes and failures of this model that we're developing to see what are the lessons that we can learn and how can this model be adjusted based on when we correctly or incorrectly predict when these atrocities are going to occur. We're really excited also that this is a university-based initiative because it gives us the opportunity to involve our students and also our faculty colleagues in this work. And some of the students in this room, raise your hand if you're in my mechanisms class right now, have already been developing case studies and helping us refine the risk assessment model. Holly's been working with a lot of her students at OSU as well to get involved in this work, and we're very excited for that. The idea is that we're going to be launching to a select view of our community for feedback of this list later this year, this summer, in July. And then at the end of this year, the plan is at the Genocide Convention anniversary on December 10th, we'll make this publicly accessible and available to all, and then it will be updated on a very regular basis after that. That's a kind of broad overview of this. So the idea with this panel is to introduce this idea to you, but also to talk about how this field of risk assessment and atrocity forecasting has changed and grown over the years, and where it should be going in the future, and how can this collaboration be something that adds value to this conversation rather than duplicates amazing work that's already being done. I'm going to turn it over to Holly now to continue this work, but then and then I'm going to open the conversation to introduce our other panelists. But first, I'm going to introduce Holly Nzita-Dira, who is a professor of sociology at The Ohio State University and is also a policy analyst at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, and she'll explain a little bit more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carrie. I think you did it all, so I will be very brief in that sense. But I just wanted to echo, I think yesterday we were having this great conversation about how, so many things are changing and there is a lot of doom and gloom tied to this, but there's also a lot of hope. And I think this is a project that can represent how things can change for the better. So as Carrie mentioned, I served on the U.S. Political Instability Task Force from 2014 until when it was disbanded about a year and a half ago. And this task force started in 1994 with the idea that academics and full-time government practitioners should come together and share knowledge about risk assessment. And the task force was broader than what we're doing in the sense that it predicted instability, authoritarian breakdown, which is why, no one wants us in this current government. We also predicted civil war, we predicted atrocities. So I had the chance, right when I finished my PhD, to work with them, and then starting in 2020 was the main atrocity forecaster. And this was an instance where when it was disbanded, I thought, oh no, because even though it wasn't public, we were able to share the forecast with other governments. We always shared them with the UN. So we had an ability to share these widely. And this was an instance in which we could chat with partners and our great partners here, partners at AAPG, many other places, and get a sense of how we could actually build upon the work that was done specific to atrocity forecasting and try to enhance it. And you see I have my computer here because I want to hear from you all what you think can be done and from our fantastic panelists of what we can build upon even better. In particular, what this model was doing for the atrocity side was forecasting deaths of civilians tied to specific groups with a threshold of 1,000 deaths in a year. And I want to point out that this is vital and that the Early Warning Project does something similar with respect to new onsets only. And then the Atrocity Forecasting Project in Australia does something similar, and they also include ongoing violence in their forecasts. One of the things I worked hard when I was the main forecaster to do is to drop the threshold of deaths. We can debate this for many hours, but there's no real magical reason why you would set the threshold at 1,000. So we dropped it to 500, and that took quite a bit of time. And one of the benefits of being able to do it ourselves, rather than for the government, is we can make choices like this. So going forward, we'll look at thresholds of 500 deaths, but we'll also go lower, right? Every death matters when we're thinking about atrocity. Another thing we're going to focus on is looking at group-based violence, which is critical, but we all know that atrocities can be more indiscriminate. There are crimes against humanity, for instance. So we're also going to be looking at non-group-based atrocities and trying to forecast those as well. In addition, we're trying, and hopefully we'll succeed, to use AI and some newer tools to scrape news media to get a broader breadth of atrocity. So far I've talked about killing, and we know that deaths are critical when we think about atrocities, but we also know that atrocities involve gender-based violence. They involve displacement, they involve internment. And we don't have great global data on this violence across space and time. And you need data across as many countries as possible for as many years as possible to be able to forecast this well. So we're trying to create additional data so we can include things like injuries, like gender-based violence, like displacement, and have a broader sense of atrocity when we're engaging in this forecasting work. One of the other things we're hoping to do and working on right now with the team of my fantastic students is trying to create a network-based approach to atrocity forecasting. We all know that the global risk landscape is changing, that violence is international, and it's always been internationalized, arguably, but we have situations like Ukraine, and a lot of the existing models look at within-state atrocities, and we're trying to think critically about how we can use emergence in network-based models to actually forecast these atrocities as well. And then finally, as Carrie mentioned, we're going to use all of this to do in-depth case studies. We're mixed methods researchers and believe strongly that we should draw on all of the tools in our toolkit. So we're going to be using a number of different qualitative techniques and looking at near misses in the forecast, trying to think about which places did we get wrong? Was it an artifact of the data? Is it something that happened in that country? And we're also thinking critically about subnational forecasting. That's also one of the new advents in this field, is thinking about subnational risk, subnational onset. So thinking about this as well. I'm going to turn it back to Carrie to introduce the rest of the panelists, but I just wanted to say I appreciate you all listening to us and look forward to all the feedback that you have.
Thank you, Holly. Now I'm going to introduce our other amazing panelists. So next to Holly is Ernesto Verdeja, who's Associate Professor of Peace Studies and Global Politics at Notre Dame University. Ernesto's been studying the practice of predicting atrocities and assessing risk, along with probably everything else important about atrocity prevention for many years. He's really one of those scholars that I just always keep going back to and want to know what he thinks whenever we're doing anything. So thank you, Ernesto, for being here. Next to him is Ben Valentino, who's a professor of government at Dartmouth College. And he, as I said, is also the brains behind the Early Warning Project out of the Simon Scott Center at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And finally, at the end, is Annie Bird, who is a research coordinator at the Auschwitz Institute and also founder and principal consultant at the Red Thread Lab. Before going into civil society and this work, Annie was also a senior policy advisor at the U.S. State Department's Conflict and Stabilization Operations, Bureau of Conflict Stabilization Operations. So we're really happy to have them all and their expertise here. Maybe I'll start things off with a question for you, Ben. The Early Warning Project is really one of the most visible and widely used atrocity forecasting models out there. And it's also seen really significant changes over the years. And anyone who's in this community and in the atrocity prevention study group knows that one constant feature of that study group every year too is that Ben does an assessment of all of these different models, watch lists, and things that are out there now, and there are many. So there's no one who knows more about the vast scope of what these different forecasting and assessment models look like. So Ben, I'm wondering if you can start us off by talking a little bit about how both the Early Warning Project, but also more broadly the practice of atrocity forecasting has changed as you've been engaging in this area, and what lessons have you been learning along the way?
Well, it's been a long time. I started on the Political Instability Task Force, which was initially called the State Failure Task Force in 1996, working on that model that has evolved over the years. And that was really the model that led to the one that the museum now uses, the Early Warning Project model. And I mean, I think a lot of the changing story has been greater and greater access to data, which is what all these models are hungry for. And the better the data that we feed them, the better the forecasts that come out the other side. So, when we started, we didn't even have really a systematic list at all of genocides or politicides or mass atrocities or whatever you wanted to call it. So that was obviously the first task to do, is just put together the first list of these things to try to conceptualize them. And that took a lot of early work. I mean, still, if you go to a conference where people are talking about genocide, you can spend most of the conference just debating what counts as genocide and what doesn't. And so that's still part of the work of any of these kinds of forecasting mechanisms, but that was a bigger part, I think, at the early stages. But even when we did, we began just looking at state-sponsored domestic mass killings. So we had a list of those, and for a long time, that was all we had. And there weren't any other data sets out there to do forecasts on. And we built on that. Eventually, we added non-state actors into the list and mass killings that happen in non-state areas. So all of those kinds of things evolved. And then at the same time, the inputs to the model. So if you think of these events, mass killings, atrocities, whatever you want to call them, it's the dependent variable. The model really lives on the independent variables, the inputs into the model. What is it that's associated with those things on the other side? And there's been a lot of progress on developing the data that we use. So again, when we started, we had a handful of inputs from the World Bank collecting data on things like GDP and population. Those are still, of course, important inputs into any model. We had data from the World Health Organization on infant mortality rates. Again, that goes into the model. But all the data that we might want to have on things like government structures, how democratic and in what ways are different countries democratic, those were very rough when we started. We just had basically one organization called Polity. gave us one number to describe how democratic a country was. Now we have organizations like VDEM, called the Varieties of Democracy Project, that has dozens and dozens of variables that help us describe the regime of a different country. Each of those feeds into our models in different ways. So the input side has changed a lot too. I'd say there's been less change in terms of exactly the methods that we use to produce forecasts. There have been changes, but to be honest, when you look at them, it's not a huge change. We're not using some advanced machine learning models for this. We have experimented with those, but in the end, didn't find them to give us a lot of advantage over there. So there's still, I think, room in that area. But to me, that's the story. The story is a story of evolving data that has allowed us to make different kinds of forecasts. And I think, for this project that you guys are describing, that will continue to be the biggest challenge. If you want to do things that other models haven't done, you have to be able to get the data. And that's an expensive and difficult thing to do. Collect that data, keep it up to date, especially if you want those models to, like, for example, I'll shut up after I finish this thought. Most of our data is at best a year old when we feed it into our models. So, like we get a GDP number for a country. That number, by the time we got it and put it into our model, it's actually closer to 2 years old. It's looking backward in time because we don't know in real time what the GDP of every country is. And that's true for almost all the inputs into our models. So you can imagine if we want to forecast something like a mass atrocity so that we can take action, it would sure be nice to not be working with data that's coming from 2 years in the past. But it's just the nature of the world that those data are not generated as quickly as we would like them to be, or at least not all of the data that feed into our models. So that's another kind of thing at the frontier here is how do we not just get more different data, but get the data that we already have more quickly.
Annie, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, is this on? No, it ran out of batteries.
There's one right behind you.
Annie, can you talk a little bit about, during your time at State, how did you see atrocity forecasting, whether the private ones that like we never got to see at the public or some of these more public models, how did you see atrocity forecasting being used? What were the biggest gaps of information or what were the challenges you faced in moving from the knowledge generated by these forecasts and generating political action?
Oh, what a fun question. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Just a moment it's just an honor to be at Binghamton always, and a shout out to Nadia Rubai and a shout out to the faculty fellows who I'm instructing, the global faculty fellows, which are incredible. And just because I'm guessing here, I want to say that we all created 6 different parallel policies last night in our faculty fellow check-in, and they're global, so you're already making an impact. So, so State Department, this is now like over a decade ago. I would say we did a few things. One was we used this kind of forecasting, like the models, the lists was part of our country selection process. So the idea was under President Obama, atrocity prevention was a national security interest. We needed to first push the US government to select countries to focus on. So we looked at this risk list that is described here. Well, it's an internal intelligence community risk list. But that wasn't good enough for us. We also wanted to look at early warning project, and we also wanted to create our own because everybody wants to create their own list, no matter how many good lists and how many are out there. So one is just the general point is, do we need another list? Don't we have enough lists? Can we use the list? So anyway, but that's just, but still everyone wants their own list and, okay, so you get that point. So we look at the list and then we look at all the lists and we say, okay, this is our list. And then we would do the important work of, which I love that you're integrating into this project, is the qualitative assessment. And again, I've got things to say about how I think the quantitative risk assessment, from our perspective could be, improved from this very kind of practitioner point of view, which we can get into later. But just to run through the kind of government experiences, first use these lists to select countries. Then we would do a qualitative risk assessment framework, which I helped draft with USAID, Lawrence Wucher, who's at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And that's actually online still, and it's still online somehow. So if you want to look at the state aid atrocity assessment framework, it's still up. It hasn't been erased from the internet. Any day now, though, so download it quickly. And that was really a way to be able to say, okay, once you know what countries you're going to look at, now we need to build off the years and years of conflict assessment frameworks. That was our starting point. And what does atrocity risk have to say? What's the supplemental guidance on top of that? And there we really looked at key actors, specifically, potential perpetrators, their motives and means, who were they targeting, enablers, which I know was discussed yesterday. So we would we would assess all of those key actors, then move into grievances and resiliencies within the situation, and then windows of risk and triggers. So that was kind of the qualitative assessment we would do. And then we would move into also the piece, which I think is really exciting that you're looking at, is the responses, right? And that I think is always understudied and could really benefit from more rigorous research and analysis, because we would say, okay, if we now know, the key actors, what they're going to do when, who they're targeting, why, how, to what extent can we be a part of shifting the motives and means of potential perpetrators, how are targeted groups mobilizing self-protection strategies or peace-building strategies, what are the upcoming windows of risk and opportunity shift, and then coming up with kind of the tools. Unfortunately, when it comes to, again, a government perspective, and I think probably in civil society, we just so quickly move into our silos of tools. And it's I would love to see a new framework that gets out of, siloed tools. Even though we would have this idea, how do we shift perpetrators' motives and means, we would still be okay, what's the diplomatic, the economic, the military, this kind of toolkit approach, which is, it's just so bureaucratic, and it's not how, it doesn't take into account the really full-fledged scenarios that we were trying to outline. It's the responses didn't match these very rigorous scenarios that we were saying of how the violence could happen. It would resort to this easier kind of toolkit checkbox approach, And so we were trying to move in that direction, but I feel like, I think that could have been much more robust. So I think that is a good outline just of the kind of analysis from the US government, very, one perspective only in terms of one government.
Yeah, thank you. Ernesto, I'd love to get you in on this. You've studied the practice of trying to predict genocides and other atrocities for many years. And more recently, you've also done some fascinating work that I highly recommend on the potential for AI when it comes to early warning, particularly related to AI disinformation in Ukraine. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you see the path this field has taken and where it could be going as we integrate some of those new technologies into this practice.
Sure, great. Thank you. Thanks to Max and to Carrie for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be on the panel with all of you. So I'm familiar with all of you and all the work you've done for many years now, so it's really quite exciting. I think there's a few ways to think about this. First of all, I agree with everything Ben said, especially that really nice genealogy and history of the field of risk assessment and early warning, how it's transformed and changed over time. There's been some really dramatic changes. At the same time, there are other things that have remained relatively the same in terms of methodological approaches used, which are pretty standard quantitative social scientific approaches. I think it's also worth mentioning, and this is something that's already embedded in the conversation, but it's worth bringing to the surface that, this kind of work usually draws at least a conceptual distinction between risk assessment, which is just a general sense of what's the relative risk of some set of atrocities happening at some point, and then thinking about early warning. What are the actual short-term and immediate-term dynamics that can tell you a little bit more about timing, right? They don't necessarily predict the exact moment when it's going to happen, but they give you a sense of, oh, okay, things are really getting bad right now, which is different from risk, which is kind of comparative elevation of risk or decline of risk over time. And this connects very much to the points you were making earlier about some of these factors or variables that are used in these models, like GDP, for instance, or percentage of the population that's young or unemployed men or something like that. These are numbers that don't change. These values don't change significantly from month to month or every few weeks. But they do give you a sense of elevated risk, even if they're just proxies for something else. So I mention all of this because often when we're doing this kind of work, we're going back and forth between how do we get a sense of general risk, which allows us to create and allows, especially people like Ben and what y'all are doing now, to create these lists of what are the high risk cases. The high risk cases usually you already know. The very high risk cases, if you read the New York Times A section, that was a joke, but in any case, you know what they are. But those middle level, like the next numbers 15 through 30 or something like that, that's where this work is extremely valuable. Because even though, for instance, they might give you a false positive sense of something that may be coming in the short term, false positives today can be true positives a year or a year and a half later. They give you a sense of the cases that you should be thinking about that you aren't thinking about. One thinks of a few years ago, like Cameroon, right? Nobody was talking about Cameroon. We know the cases that are really kind of the dramatic cases of masculine, et cetera, but there's other cases that are kind of under the surface a little bit, but they're really important. And that's one of the many reasons why these types of lists are important. As far as getting to your specific point about the use of new technologies here, I think the first thing to emphasize, I'll tell you just kind of a two-sentence version of what you're referring to, of what I and some colleagues have been doing. But before I say that, I think the important thing to keep in mind is any particular project that focuses on one dimension of risks or indicators really needs to be nested within all of the other stuff that we know, right? So that we don't overemphasize or prioritize or even fetishize one particular kind of technology or one particular set of indicators as if that's going to give us a magical key to understanding what's coming down the line. The reason I say that is because, for instance, I'm working on this project with some colleagues who are computer scientists who are experts in AI. So they're AI computer scientists, particularly visual AI, and then also some area specialists. And this is a project that looked at social media, but particularly visual social media. So think of images, memes, video, things like that on social media, particularly in Telegram in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. In the lead up to it and then the onset and then afterwards, looking at variation in different types of dehumanizing or polarizing discourse, particularly in imagery, because it's very hard to process that in real time and scale. Text is very easy. Kill the X, I hate the Y, et cetera. That's easy to process using existing computer technology. But visual cues are very, very hard to do at scale very, very quickly. And that's where a lot of dehumanizing, polarizing, disinfo, misinfo is gone. It makes sense. It's easy to do now. So we looked at that and we were able to identify kind of general trends in the escalation, not only in the amount, but also in variations in types and kind of quality. We were able to identify what are the different nodes and places on social media platforms that are pushing this stuff. So it's a really nice addition to the set of indicators for thinking about short-term and mid-term prognosticators for this. But again, it only is valuable if it's nested within all of this other important work that other folks are doing, if that makes sense. AI is useful there, but AI is only something that enhances the ability of human beings to do the really important interpretive work. And so therefore the AI has to be tested and retested on the expertise of people who know the cases really well. And this is why we have Ukrainians, NGOs, and other experts and Russians, et cetera, working on it. So that's kind of the thinking of that. I do have some other, but go ahead, back to you.
Just wanted to follow on a couple of things there. One is just to emphasize, if you didn't catch it, because it's really important to know about the way essentially all the existing models are, is that they are really risk assessment models. And so you could think of that in the same sense of, you go into your cardiologist and your cardiologist, sees what your blood lipid levels are, and they see when you have hypertension, and they ask about whether you're exercising, and they measure your weight. And they put all those things together, and then they say, you seem to be at risk for a heart attack. And you're like, well, doc, when's that heart attack gonna happen? And your doctor's not gonna tell you it's next Tuesday, right? Because the doctor doesn't know. The model that the doctor uses doesn't tell you when the heart attack is gonna occur. It tells you that you're at elevated risk for a heart attack. In fact, the most common model used by cardiologists is called the PREVENT model. And that model, by some measure, it's complicated what this number exactly means, but it's about 80% accurate at predicting heart attack mortality over a 10-year period. The early warning project model is about 80% accurate using the same kind of measure over a 2-year period. So these are structural risk models. They kind of tell us who's at risk, but they don't tell us when the risk is going to happen. And the reason for that is back to what I was saying before. If you think about the inputs into those models, they're not changing next Tuesday, right? Just like your blood lipid levels are not changing next Tuesday, and that's why you got a heart attack. The thing that triggers the heart attack, or the thing that triggers the escalation from a country that's generally at high risk for an atrocity to the actual atrocity, those things are not, for the most part, entering into our models. And this gets to the second point. Why not? Because the data, it's not that we don't know what those things are. Of course, we don't know what they all are, but we have some ideas about what they are. But our data don't track those things, and we don't have data that go back far enough in time that we can build a model that could include those things. So for example, we know that certain kinds of changes in government, certain types of protests, those things are associated with transition from a at-risk state to a escalate to violent state. But we don't have great data sets going back far enough in time tracking those things specifically. And again, we're not updating those data sets in real time, so that even if we did, our model wouldn't tell us about the increased risk because of the protest until a year after the protest happened. That gets to this last point, which is one way now that I think we're on the verge of being able to solve that problem, which has bedeviled this whole industry for the 30 years I've been involved in it, is AI. And it's not in using AI to do the forecasting. It's in using AI to gather the data for us, to go back over the massive corpus of news reports and internet documents and plot where every change in government happened and where every protest happened and what the protest was about and all those kinds of things that normally we'd have to hire Holly's grad students and undergrads to do, and it would take them years, and they'd have to continue to do it year on year on year. And we're now at the verge of a moment when we might be able to automate those tasks, do it in real time, and feed it into our model. So I think that's, a hopeful development.
Yeah, I can add just really quickly, although I appreciate that you got there, but that's what I was thinking too, is I know we talk often, I think, of how AI causes problems, and I'm a professor, it causes immense problems for grading every day, but it does have this immense benefit as well, in that it can automate what, as Ben was mentioning, students could take, a year to do. It still requires really careful checking. So we're working right now on trying to see how feasible is this. And, it's learning as it goes, but it still requires checking. It still requires humans, obviously. The other thing I'd note really quickly is I think this is where the qualitative component becomes critical. And that was something, as we were trying to think, as Sandy mentioned, do we need another list, right? And at first, do we need more lists? And I will say, when the PITF, and then it was formerly, as Ben mentioned, it changed names a number of times. It was the Program for Geostrategic Risk prior to being disbanded. When it was disbanded, I received maybe 8 or 9 emails from folks around the world saying, like, hey, where's the list? We're waiting for it, including at the UN. And that gave me hope that there could be space for something else in addition to what exists. But yeah, I want to underscore, I think the qualitative component can be critical because then you can identify, here are 20 countries to be tracking more carefully, and then it becomes more manageable to try to, or even 10, right? However many folks are looking at, a bit more manageable to track real-time changes within those spaces.
Ernesto, I know you had some other things.
Yeah, can I switch topic a little bit?
Let's do it.
That would do it. So one thing that's really interesting about all of these advances is not only the complexity of it and the ability to give us more and more reliable risk assessments and often even kind of better senses of really important triggering events or triggering moments. But nevertheless, so those are all really important advances. Nevertheless, there is this realization that comes from everybody in this room knows this, that often conflicts and often mass violence spills over borders, right? National borders are actually, in many contexts, just lines in the sand or lines on a map. They're not much more than that. And so one of the questions I have for all of you from your different perspectives is how you think about transnational dynamics, the regional dynamics of conflict. I think you talk about this in the project already. And so I'm thinking, for instance, the Lake Chad region, the Great Lakes region, parts of West Africa. We can think of all these different contexts where the violence dynamics are crossing borders, and that's really, really important element. The question really has kind of two parts to it, or at least two elements to it. One is, how do you think about that, and how might we model that? And two is also whether it matters for the purposes of forecasting and early risk assessment. The reason I say that is because one of the things you don't want to do when you're creating these models, they're already so complex and so hard to run, you don't want to just add complexity and more fine-grained analysis that doesn't necessarily improve forecasting or risk assessment, right? So one could imagine answering my question to say, like, well, that's important, but if you look at the actual cluster of countries next to each other, you could develop a general risk indicator for that cluster of countries, and that's good enough. So that's why I kind of preface it that way. But I'm curious what your thinking is about regional dynamics and how they might affect or impact risk assessments.
And just to throw another question to build on top of that, not to answer because I'm not going to answer, is it's not just the spillover effect from atrocity violence within a country, right? Because a lot of these risk assessment and forecasting models have been developed really focusing on international conflict or conflict that starts within a state, right? And because we kind of thought we were beyond the moment as a global community where there was international conflict, right? And now that's totally been upended with Russia, Ukraine, with the US and Iran, with Israel and Lebanon. Like, atrocity violence is no longer just international, it's also international again, right? So how do we consider that when we're thinking about these models too? That's another thing that we're thinking about.
I mean, so I have no idea how to do this from a quantitative perspective, and I don't know actually if it's possible, but I was, when I was thinking about your question on this issue, and it's also the subnational and transnational, but like, this is more for Ben and Ernesto and well, all of you except for me. Like, is it possible to like upend the state using states at all? Instead of having a state list, could you have a potential perpetrator group, like who's the perpetrator and who's the targeted group, and have a list that focuses on that? Again, how you do that, I don't know, but like, focusing on the specific groups. I just feel like we're so, I mean, our field has been questioning the over-reliance on the state system for forever, and I don't know, is that at all, have you,
So, of course, to forecast whether violence, so you're talking about, imagine we have a list of all the groups in the world, groups, whatever that means exactly, right? And then we have to ask for each group, what's the chances that they are involved in an atrocity with one of the other groups? Or what we would call dyads in our profession. But we'll just call them pairs of groups. Because why do we need a new term? The number of combinations is, you couldn't wrap your head around that. And worse, some of these groups that we think of in retrospect as the group that, say, got targeted, that group was invented in the process of the targeting. Think of in the Cambodian example. new people, right? Which is one term that the Khmer Rouge used for people who they targeted. That wasn't a term that was used in Cambodia before the Khmer Rouge took over and decided to target that group. So the groups, any list of group that we had would be missing some groups that are actually the ones that are most at risk because they're the ones created in the midst of this. Now, there are ways that we can go somewhere in the middle, try to come up with some idea about these groups. Are they identified ethnic or racial or religious groups? We do have some lists of those, although they're worse. Those lists are worse quality than you would think they are. A lot of the groups that are targeted are political groups. We don't have great lists of those. There's no data set where you can go to and find a list of all the active political parties in any given country. That data set doesn't exist. Just that. So you can see how challenging it would be to do that. And so that's the biggest problem, although we would love to be able to forecast at a local level. And again, maybe in a particular country, we could think about doing that. But that's a similar problem to the problem of why are any of these models forecasting interstate atrocities? And that's just another variant of that same question, right? There's 200 countries in the world. Theoretically, any one of those 200 countries could tomorrow attack one of the other 200 countries, and an atrocity could take place during that attack. And so the model would first have to have a model of, is country A likely to attack country Q? And then if that attack occurs, what is the possibility that there'll be an atrocity in that attack? And you can imagine how complicated a model that would be. For most of the second half of the 20th century and all of the 21st century, those interstate atrocities have been relatively rare compared to civil wars. But we are definitely seeing an increase in them, which makes us want to be able to forecast them more.
I can add quickly for Andy's point on groups. I remember the PITF looked at that a little bit, maybe in 2018 or 2017 with this idea, can we actually forecast groups? And as Ben was noting, there's such a paucity of data on the groups to begin with. So then we decided to look at groups that were often committing atrocities, and could we forecast escalations in those atrocities, essentially, if you start with a list of groups that are kind of common actors in that space. And a lot of it came down to, we don't have great data on these groups to begin with. And a lot of it was really things we already knew, like changes in the balance of power. So a lot of it is already built into the models as triggers, in the sense that it would be, is there some change in the dynamics of power within a country? And after that change, then you would often see an escalation in violence. So there was some effort put towards that. And I think, as you're both pointing out, a lot of our data are still really state-centric. And this does present problems for the models. If you think about it, if it's at the country level and what's recognized as a country, this means for Palestine, there's not great data. Often this is lumped into Israel, and this is really tricky. It also means that in most of the existing models, small island nations are excluded. And I think this is tremendously tricky, because it means that Solomon Islands, or sometimes Fiji, like different nations that actually might have elevated risk, are not being captured because there's not great country level data over time, which then means if you try to get to a subnational level, it gets even trickier. I had actually done my dissertation many years ago on subnational levels of violence, and could we forecast onset at a subnational level. And I think that if the data exists, it would be fantastic, but we're still struggling to get good country level data for all countries and nations around the world. So I think it's still quite a ways before we get there. The other thing I'd note to Carrie's question on sort of international dynamics, a lot of these existing models for a while have tried to deal with this by having some level of an indicator of, is there violence in a neighboring country, or is there violence within 200 kilometers of that country, trying to get at that, but it's certainly imperfect. And I think As Ben's pointing out, there are newer methods, neural networks that I can only pretend to try to understand, that are trying to be able to speak to network-based methods of predicting international atrocities. So I do think that'll be possible in the coming years.
There is, just as a small point, it's when you look at a map, or what we call a heat map, which is a map that kind of gives you in this case, different levels of risk. For instance, when I look at an early warning, an EWP map, even though there aren't necessarily indicators that are regionally based, you see the clustering by region, right? So looking at the map shows you already something's going on here. And from the research, we know that there's often a diffusion effect. If you have a lot of instability or violence in one place, it can diffuse to neighboring places. But I simply mention this because it's one thing of trying, the challenges of getting the data and trying to create a method or a model that captures that kind of regional dynamic. But when you look at the map, you realize, oh, okay, this region actually has other stuff going on. Doesn't necessarily tell you much more than that. You have to have the subnational or the national and subnational analysis.
Yeah, so I'm really curious, if you all don't mind me asking you a question. What do you all think is missing from existing initiatives? So I just mentioned, for instance, that we don't have great data on some countries, and I think this is something that's missing. What else is missing as you think about what exists? And it could be just because the data doesn't exist, but it could exist. Or things you think people aren't considering as they think about creating projects like this.
I mentioned a few. I think I love that you're lowering the threshold. And I love that you are getting outside of deaths, but you still mentioned the data issue there, but I think that is really important. I think it's just fascinating, like this project's still on this panel, we're focusing on the quantitative risk list, like that is the emphasis, because there's and again, maybe that's just who's sitting here, but it's like in the field, yes, it's incredibly important. These risk lists are incredibly valuable, but I think we are not talking about the other two pieces, which you want to do in this project, from what I understand, which is one, the qualitative assessment piece, the case studies, and two, the responses to the violence, which, as we know, all of us in this room know, we have done a really good job in this field of early warning for the most part, but we have not cracked the what you do about it piece. And so I just feel we just have to keep pushing each other, all of us in this room, to work on the issue that really is what we all care about most, which is figuring out how we can get all of the smart people in this room to think about how do you crack that issue. And so I think having a conversation about, okay, now we know the countries that are at most risk, middle risk, low risk, and so what, and like, how can we use all of the tools and all of the technology and all the researchers and all of the smarts to assess, come up with very good assessments of those places that need it most, one, and then two, what are those responses? And so I just hope that we, get to some of those pieces, and I'd love to hear more about how you're beginning to conceptualize those two pieces of the project. Yeah, I'll leave it there, yeah.
I mean, I do like the idea of moving beyond not just group-based violence, but actually even putting aside the other. So, often when we argue over these terms, what counts as a mass atrocity or a mass killing, we get stuck on a couple of things. One of them is what counts as a group. Are those people targeted because they're part of a group, or were they targeting for some other reason? And we want to draw a line there. I understand why we do that sometimes. And then the other one that gets us a lot is, were their deaths intentional, or were they in some way inadvertent collateral to an attack on something else? And so we argue about all those things, and I know the reasons why we argue about them, and they're not unimportant, and for certain kinds of things, they make a big difference. But in some other way, I do think everybody in this room does and should care just about when large numbers of civilians are being killed, whether that's intentionally, whether that's indiscriminately, or any other combination of those things. And so we don't have a model that's regularly updated that does that. And so to me, I think That's one of the things that sounds most exciting about what you're thinking about. And so I urge you to be as broad with that as you can be. That really would differentiate the project. And then when you think about that, another thing we don't have in the models, people have experimented a little bit with them, but there's no good model on it. Again, it's regularly updated, is the severity in terms of the number of victims of whatever type of violence. So right now, the models just ask, what's the probability that you exceed a certain threshold? If you're talking about lowering the threshold, that's nice. But you'll still have a model that just says, do you or don't you exceed this certain threshold of deaths, when we might want to know by how much and how severe do we expect this violent event to be. We don't have a model that we can look to right now that tells us that, and I think that's quite important. It's one thing to say, I think 1,000 people are likely to be killed here in the next year, and it's another thing to say, I think, 100,000 will. And so that would be another thing you could add.
Yeah, so I think this is great. I'm super excited about this project, and it's just really exciting to be on a panel like this, to think a little bit more comparatively, more broadly about where our knowledge is on these questions. I agree with all of these points, especially the issue of the threshold. So it's, which is essentially kind of a dummy variable. Is it going to be a mass killing or not? Gotta stop using academic. So, yes or no, right? Is it a 0 or a 1, as you would say? At the same time, there is this interesting potential trade-off, which is certainly we should be more concerned about 100,000 people than a lower number of people. But there's also this potential danger, which is not really on the burden or on the shoulders of people doing this kind of work, where the lower number is discarded. It's kind of put aside. It's like, well, we can't really focus on that right now because we've got this emergency that's happening right now. So 1,000, that's terrible, but we'll get to that at the next meeting, right? No, but it's not a trivial point, right?
Because you don't get to it at the next
Because you don't get to it. And also it reinforces this aspect of a lot of atrocity prevention work where it's really atrocity reaction. You're just reacting to the crisis to crisis to crisis. Andy can speak to this very well, having been inside government, and know how you have so many different urgent challenges and you're dealing with those things immediately. I mean, everybody in this room knows this to different extents. So there is this kind of interesting question here about what happens if there's a scalability to it. And what, not incentive structure, but what that might kind of reinforce. I agree with all the other points here. I don't really have too much more to add. One thing that a few things that come to mind, so I don't have anything to add while I one is, and this might have to do much more with the qualitative side and the case study side, but is there a way of looking at the targeting of specific vulnerable populations that are very small? I'm hitting the obvious example here are LGBTQ folks, right? LGBTQ plus. Why? Because they're among the most vulnerable populations already. And we know that if we're going to go back to the state part, but also non-state actors, you often go after the most vulnerable populations because they're already not protected.
Yeah.
And those are really important indicators of something bad coming along the line. Anthropologists, kind of to put this in parallel, anthropologists have shown us often before the outbreak of formal armed conflict, especially civil war, there's an increase in spousal abuse in homes, right? Kind of quotidian violence that happens before the political violence. Now, you can't capture all of that, obviously, and it would be too much from a modeling perspective, from data, et cetera. But it would be interesting to think about whether there are ways to connect with other projects that are doing that in a systematic way that say, these are precursor events, they're abominable on their own, and they're also precursors potentially of something else. They're also indicators of risk elevation. So that's something that kind of came to mind. Another aspect that comes in that I was thinking about is climate or environmental change. Climate change isn't really quite the right word that I have in mind here because climate change by definition is a little bit slower, but I'm thinking about what the research shows. It's really, there's two things that are important. One is whether you have rapid changes in the environment. So a lot of drought, a lot of flooding going back and forth. That's a bigger issue than just kind of a rising temperature in place. That's one important point. And the second point is your governance structure. Is the government actually capable of absorbing and dealing with those types of changes? In some ways, that's the really important mediating factor. It's not just the environmental change, but it's whether the government has a capacity to deal with that. So I ask this question because I think this is more and more pressing, especially when we look at specific countries and specific cases. The large-scale quantitative stuff on climate change and conflict is a little bit vaguer on the findings, right? But I asked this question about how to think of that with the caveat or the proviso that in fact, the bigger risk indicator might be governance capacity, weak state, strong state, rather than the actual drought, rain, flooding, et cetera. I'm not sure quite how to think about that, but I wonder if there would be an added benefit to think about those factors. And I think one of the letters in Prevent has environment in it.
Yeah.
Of course, V, of course, has environment.
Volatility.
Oh, my bad, okay.
Environment.
Now I'm just being difficult.
Because of course we need an acronym.
So maybe you can say a little bit more about how you envision working that aspect into the project.
Yeah, no, I appreciate these suggestions so much. As you see, this is why I brought my computer. I was going to scribble notes, and I was like, I will never read them again. So that's why I'm typing furiously up here. Absolutely, I think the point about severity is really interesting, and I take the point too that what would this mean? So something to consider, but it is tricky when you boil it down to 0 or 1. And on the one hand, there are some great models to handle this type of data. So there's perhaps a modeling benefit as well. And I get a little nervous in the quality of the data if we're going to draw a lot of different levels. But I think you're right that we're missing a lot. So thinking about that, bearing in mind that might be tricky politically as well. The point about groups, absolutely. We have this qualitative toolkit that we can share with all of you and would love feedback on. And we were recently talking about, could we alter it a bit more to be more group specific? There's a whole section on victim groups, but trying to think through if there was a group-centered risk assessment, what could that look like? And I think that's a really compelling point in thinking about what are some of the precursors. And then this question on climate change, yes, we built it in because if you do case studies and work on the ground in places, you continually hear climate change matters tremendously in people's lived experiences. In these broader quantitative risk assessment models, they're not really building in indicators of climate change because they're not really carrying a lot of predictive power. And because a lot of the indicators we have aren't great. So you could think about like variability in rainfall and how it might change over time. But as Ernesto's mentioning, the findings with this are pretty mixed. So it really does need to be, at least right now, I think part of the qualitative assessment. And also, I think in addition to what you're mentioning, in addition to the government's response or the government structure response, people's perceptions of it. So anywhere I work, it's often people's perceptions of these changes that is really the missing link. And that's not something you can measure quantitatively, but something ideally you can think about in a case study in a qualitative format. How are people feeling these changes? What are they thinking about them? What did they expect would happen? What actually happened? And all of this is why qualitative assessment is so critical, because quantitative numbers are never going to tap into perceptions. And I think that's a lot of what's missing and why we don't see these quantitative factors really mattering in the models, because they're not actually getting at people's perceptions.
I want to open things up to the audience, but I just do want to recognize one thing that Ernesto's point about the sort of crisis hopping that often happens when we're thinking about atrocity forecasting and prevention work. And this is one thing that we're really concerned about and thinking a lot about and trying to figure out how to deal with this. Because part of us wonders, like, is releasing a list, does it reinforce the idea of only looking at the top of that list and looking at that firefighter model of atrocity prevention where we're just focused on the places that are already on fire or that are already experiencing the most severe levels of risk, where the amount of potential for actually engaging in preventive policy is so much more constrained, and the options are so much fewer than if we were looking further down that list in that sort of mid-range where there's still opportunity to do proactive work to prevent things from escalating. Is that simply a nature of releasing these lists? What are our responsibilities when it comes to, that's one thing we've been thinking a lot about. All right, I'd love to open it up for David.
I want to return, Holly, to your question about what kind of things these lists might think about. And I'm glad you all spoke about climate change, because I had three, and one of them was that. So the two remaining are, I wonder if you could speak about the changing nature of warfare and how well these lists incorporate and understand and build indicators of that. Obviously, it's top of mind because right now the US-Iran war has revealed some really dramatic shifts in the nature of warfare, much more towards drones and unmanned aerial vehicles and all of this stuff. And the second is more broadly how these risks look at technology more broadly. And here I'm thinking about, we look at these case studies of Facebook in Myanmar or elsewhere, and we've begun to develop ways of understanding that, the penetration of social media, the availability of it, the regulation of it, and start to map that against our own understanding of risk. But I wonder more broadly, as technology plays such a huge role, not just social media, but other things, how these lists incorporate both of those and how they could or should.
No, go ahead.
I can say just a couple of things, and I'm curious for the other panelists as well. The changing nature of warfare, absolutely. I do not think that is well integrated into lists right now. My former postdoc runs ACLIDcast, so like ACLID's their own conflict forecasting. We chat a lot over coffees over like, how can we do this? And we don't know. So folks have ideas. Like that is one that we have talked about sort of at length and don't have great ways to quantify that. So I think my answer really for both of these is, I think the qualitative component right now, and that gets a bit away from the list and more to the qualitative case studies, because that's when you can really be bringing in information like that. I think the same with social media, and one of the things I had written down when I thought about what is missing is a better way to measure ideology and hate speech and things of this nature. A lot of that in the quantitative models is a measure of like, does it exist, 0 or 1? And that's something, and it's going to give you something in those, but it's really the qualitative assessments where you can learn more. But I'd be curious to talk more with you and others about how you think this can be best built into the qualitative components, given everything that you've learned over time. I'll defer to others to comment too.
Take my thought? Okay, thank you. So I think this is a fantastic question. I've thought of it a little bit orthogonally. So a little bit different from kind of the way you framed it. I do think absolutely the changing nature of warfare and tech in particular is going to affect on how these things unfold in the future. But one thing that strikes me that would be basically kind of a project in parallel is, as some states, especially strong states, gain better tech for the purposes of surveillance, I'm thinking of China, right, with Uyghurs or something, they'll be able to use much less explicit, overt, direct violence in order to control the populations and instead control them in all these other ways. And my guess is as we move forward, in the next several years, we're going to see a kind of growing bifurcation between cases where we have more conventional understandings of atrocities. We have mass kill Sudan, right, or places like that, where there's an enormous amount of direct violence, violations of bodily integrity, partly because the actors themselves can't control the populations as completely as China could control its population. So we're going to see this kind of bifurcation of different forms of, if not atrocity violence, at least severe violence, repressive and destructive violence. And it would be really fascinating to start thinking about other projects that can speak in parallel to the really important work that all of y'all are doing, because I see that as kind of on the horizon, and it has to do precisely with the tech point. So it doesn't speak directly to that, but you're very much getting at it.
Over the years, I've thought a fair bit about the social media component of this, and it is tricky. You'll see, I've been in this long enough, my mind always goes to the practical problem of how would we extract the data we want from social media to give us an indication of what's going on in the world. And you just think of, you have to understand how these models work, but just think about what broadly they're doing is They're looking at some pattern that appears in social media that we can detect and trying to correlate that with something that happened in the real world, right? So we need a regular pattern in social media that lines up with a regular pattern of violence in the real world. Well, social media, though it seems like it's been here forever, actually hasn't been around that long in the grand scheme of things. And thankfully, the kinds of events that we worry about are relatively rare. Even if we go down to pretty low levels, they're relatively rare. The Early Warning Project list, which has got that 1,000 threshold, we get about 2 new cases a year. And if you figure social media in any real sense has probably been around less than 20 years, that doesn't give us a lot of pattern recognition to work with. But worse than that is that social media is constantly changing. And so the patterns that we might see in social media are constantly changing. Old people like us think about Facebook as social media, but no one under the age of 25 has ever even opened a Facebook account. And so if we began to look at even just over that 20-year period, the patterns in social media, they would change dramatically because the platforms that people are using are constantly changing and the types of people who are using them are constantly changing. So when Twitter starts, it has a few tens of thousands of people. Those aren't the same kind of people who are using Twitter today. Very different people are joining the platforms over time. They're using different languages. They're using, they're more or less likely to be involved in different things. So it is a devilishly hard problem to track, even though we kind of know there's things obviously happening in social media that are related to the violence we see in the real world. But building a forecasting model off of them, and just back to that practical problem, is really hard.
I just wonder if there's ways to get at these issues like tech and some of these niche issues which come up in every conversation like this. Like, what is not the way you do it, but another way to do it that still grabs the data in a systematic, rigorous way and can feed into the qualitative assessment? Is that kind of stuff, are we building those models, not this model, but other models that are taking into account these very new and important pieces, and are you seeing anything out there that's doing that well?
You can, again, with lower thresholds of what the event is that you're interested in, you can do this.
Yeah.
And I've seen people do it in a particular context in a particular country where they're looking at, instead of looking at, is there an atrocity? When did it happen? It didn't happen now it happened. So you just have one piece. You're looking at, attacks on a certain community. And maybe they didn't rise to the level of what anybody would call a mass atrocity, but those things happen with some regularity, and you can correlate what's going on social media with those attacks at a much lower level. And the hard part is always aggregating that up, because it's not always the case that low-level attacks lead to something that we call a mass atrocity. So that's usually the technique I see, is to make the outcome something that happens more frequently. So that you can track it, or to focus on a particular area where the relationship between social media and the real world is relatively constant, instead of trying to group all Facebook users or all Twitter users globally into one giant analysis.
I can give a 10-second example. I know there's some work in studies of violent extremism that's looking at the gamification. And there's all this rhetoric online prior to folks going out and engaging in violent extremism, where they'll use terms like high score or things from video games. And I know there's really interesting work being done to try to track that, but you have to know, again, what are these terms, and really be embedded in these communities online to have a sense first of what's going on, and then how do you study it?
All right, I'm going to collect 3 questions, quick questions, and then you can respond. You take the ones you want.
Just in terms of the risk assessment, early warning, and response gap, is there an argument to be made for when you have both qualitative and quantitative results that show a really elevated risk for a particular country, and there's good reason to believe that it's the political leadership of that country that really needs to be told about this, to really know about this, because there's domestic policy measures to take, that it's just a smart idea to call it something else than atrocity prevention, because nobody wants to hear that their country's at risk for mass atrocities, especially when you're indexing things like state fragility or incapacity or executive overreach. So do you make up a new word to call it rather than?
I mean, David and I are laughing because we did atrocity assessments in countries that were definitely not called atrocity assessments, and we used every other word, and that's part of the work.
And Max, the problem was sometimes not even using a different term for the foreign government. It was with our own government.
Oh, yeah.
So if we wanted the US Embassy in country Y to allow us to come in and do all this work of atrocity risk assessment, then we couldn't call it that, because the US Embassy would be like, no.
use the
Don't
A
say
word.
that. Don't use the A word.
So
Call it,
what's the best practice of making up a
All right, I'm getting a new question.
So great, guys. So on the social media, might there be scope for maybe in addition to doing the content analysis is super tricky and you need the local context, etc. But what about looking at policy and practice of social media company? For example, when Meta made the change to limit the number of forwards that you could do in a single WhatsApp message down to 15 from it being unlimited, civil society in Sri Lanka, in the midst of sectarian violence, reported a significant drop. So that might be an easier way to get at some piece of that. But then underscoring Annie on the responses piece, and as you look at the responses piece, Holly, you flagged this, I want to keep your attention on it. We need case studies of non-events. And so much of our response data in this field comes from things that happen and then making a counterfactual of, well, if we had done X, then maybe it wouldn't have happened. And I think that's been really problematic for the field. So if you could get around that, that would be wonderful.
One more question.
Thank you very much. My question is about the most vulnerable group among all targeted minorities, it's children. So are you going to include this parameter into your model? Because, for example, famine is used as a weapon, also child soldiers also is a problem for many armed conflicts, and I think that we should have this parameter specifically.
Any responses to any of these?
I was just gonna say obviously, the point of all these models has to be that somehow they are useful in prevention. Where we don't just want to say we think these things are gonna happen and then no action follows from it. And there's no question we've just done so much less good work on the second bit, what works in prevention. There's lots of people who are trying, it is a harder question by far. I always remember when I was in graduate school, article came out, was published, and it was like, we looked at where the UN intervened and wars got worse. And everyone was like, oh no, the UN is failing. But of course, that's not what happened. The UN goes to the worst wars, right? And so that's the problem with when we study prevention, is that we don't apply prevention randomly like a doctor might apply, in a clinical trial of a vaccine where we give it to a bunch of people and randomly select them. We do the opposite. We apply prevention in the hardest places. And so it often fails. And then, it's easy to say, well, that prevention strategy was terrible. But you applied it in all the hardest places. And this gets back to that, the problem with these lists is if everybody focuses at the top of the list, those are also probably the places where prevention is going to be the hardest. And we just have much less good work in those other cases where maybe some preventive strategy worked and we don't even study it because it never did lead to atrocity. But that's a hard thing to do. It is different than the kinds of lists and early warning we're talking about up here, but yeah, we need a lot more.
I could add quickly on children. Yes, so in some of the data we're trying to create explicitly include children as their own targeted group. ACLED also has data on children and women. I think they lump them together for whatever reason. And then in the case study, we pull out children in a couple of different places. So in the toolkit, both in terms of possible victimized communities, but also in terms of actors in their own right, in terms of preventive policies and engaging with children. So absolutely. But if you have other ideas, please tell us. And then I love the idea on sort of the change in policy and practice for social media companies, because that also matters, but makes it more manageable to collect. So thank you for that. And then I just wanted to underscore the case studies of non-events. So for those who aren't in the field, or we're using academic language often. So like we have a lot of information on places where atrocities occurred, and a lot less information on the places where maybe it was predicted and it didn't happen, or places that had high risk for a while but don't see mass atrocity unfold. What's happening in those places, and what can we learn from those places? So I think that's a really important point to underscore, that as a field, we spent a lot more time trying to understand the dynamics of occurrence than non-occurrence, and they're not necessarily symmetrical. So spending a lot more time thinking about non-occurrence.
I would just add along those lines, one additional thing is to think of the factors that are basically resilience factors, and looking about the class of resilience factors that are well established to work as resilience. So it's hard to model some of that, because some of the stuff from sociology tells us about the density of social networks and, like, how do you model that for all countries over a long period of time? But the point is, by looking at resilience factors, it gives you a sense of explaining why you get these kind of false positives in terms of prediction. And that's really, really important. A lot of people know that there are resilience factors, and we know more or less what some of those are, but it's a little hard to model that. To your point about language, it just reminds me a little bit of when the Global Fragility Act was put together, which was such a great idea in many respects, but calling it fragility and then telling countries, you're going to be on our list of global fragility countries and we're going to help you. They were like, no thanks. So language does matter a lot, right? Absolutely.
I'm taking two more, because we're almost out of time. Oh, there are three if they're quick.
Hi, so part of what, since I was in the class that we've been using the PREVENT model and exploring different case studies, and part of the model is the potential perpetrator network. And we're talking about social media companies and like how like they're also implicated, but then I'm also thinking about other countries who fund armed groups who are also implicated, because those groups then commit atrocities. So then you're mapping networks of arms trade or money in that case. So I'm wondering if these networks of other countries funding armed groups that are committing atrocities, like if you are researching that, because then I think that could be more informative in the prevention aspect of tracking how these people are getting these funds to then commit atrocity.
Hold the thought.
A quick one or a long?
Quick.
Well, sorry, so I'm trying to make it as quick as possible. In Canada, to give you some statistics here. Indigenous population make about 5% of the population. Women are about 50% of the incarceration rates in Canada. Women are 16 more times to face homicide rates in Canada. The issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people are very much an ongoing issue. So we're in the midst of an ongoing atrocities faced by Indigenous people. So Indigenous people are very much in midst of the genocide and ethnocide, not just in Canada, but globally. We don't really have models to measure that. I mean, in a country like Canada, as you correctly pointed out, these are state-centric. And at the UN level, we're trying to work on systems to develop culturally specific models to help indicate and provide prevention of the ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples. And it's a real big issue. I mean, Indigenous people account for 80 to 90% of the global cultural and linguistic diversity. And every week we have an ethnocide or a cultural genocide of a language dying around the world. So I would really love to hear your opinion on this and how we can work together at the UN level to provide prevention and predictive models at that level. Thank you.
Thank you. Last one.
Hi, it's Charity. I wanted to kind of touch on 3 points that you guys also sort of touched on, but things that feel very important to me is like this high risk versus low risk scenario. So I'm also in mechanisms. I left to Chile, and for me, when you think about it, you're like, this seems like a safe and decent place, but also indigenous ethnocide, deforestation, logging issues, and then the salt brines, which are also now being fast tracked to like 8 to 12 months for permits for people to just go in and kind of mine these rare earth minerals. And something that I also think about that doesn't really come up when we look at these lists is that the EPI, or the Environmental Performance Index, also has this hierarchical list of like, this is a green country, this is not. And when I was looking at that, it's like Pakistan is like the second to last on the list, and Sweden's at the top. But the places that makes the textiles for IKEA is Pakistan. And so this is something that those lists don't really track. And I think about like the comparative aspect of maybe taking a list and being like, okay, who's the top and who's the bottom, and maybe doing cross comparison more closely there. And additionally, something that I've been thinking about a lot with AI coming out is possibly laws and policies with human rights. And Article 27 says like people have the right to like scientific claims or whatever, that advancements. And my idea is like the right to documentation, because I feel like that's really scary as people don't really have the legal understanding of what would count as documentation. And also with AI producing visual imageries all the time, it's really hard to challenge. So something that feels concerning for me.
Great, so just a few seconds for everyone to respond. 30 seconds each.
Okay, 30 seconds, real quick. Ashley, thanks for that point on funding. I know we're thinking about like sanctions tied to arms, but we can chat more about funding and these networks. Yeah, I totally agree they're important. On the point on collaborating on thinking about, you know, the many atrocities against Indigenous peoples, absolutely, please let's talk. And I think with all of this too, your point brings out like a lot of what we're talking about is tied to colonialism, right? And we have to find a way to acknowledge this, that we have a number of different global factors and repression that shaped a lot of the current realities in all of the places that we're talking about. So how do we appropriately acknowledge that while still doing this work? And I think your point too about different peoples brings in the importance of taking a real intersectional approach. And then, on the EPI list and all of this, I think that I wrote down the point, right to documentation. And the one thing I'll note too is I think a lot of this comes back to Ernesto's point on, you know, systematic discrimination, which is no less horrific and pernicious, and perhaps maybe more pernicious because it's slow. Right? I always have my graduate students read a book on slow violence. It's Rob Nixon's book. If you haven't read it, it's fantastic because it really makes this clear point that we often pay attention to this rapid violence. And I'm guilty of this. I study Rwanda. But we have these really slow moving structures and systems that we often don't pay as much attention to. And does this actually make them more pernicious? Because it's harder to track this violence over time.
Okay, so I would just echo all those points. And in fact, a lot of the violence against Indigenous communities, and not exclusively for them, is often a kind of what we refer to sometimes as, rather than direct violence, or in addition to direct violence, structural violence, right? So it's this kind of attritional long-term. It also becomes integrated into systems of governance, it becomes normalized. So therefore, because it's not episodic and spectacular violence, we don't think of it as something necessarily kind of in the same way that we might for some of these models. But it also means it's a lot harder to model. Like, we can't forget that, right? So it's not as if it's only an epistemological problem where we're just not thinking about the right categories. It's also, you can count bodies. That's the point. It's much harder to count and make sense of systematic, institutionalized, normalized repression and marginalization. You can do that, but to do it at scale across 193 countries over a long period of time is kind of tough. The last point I'll make is, you know, a number of you, and I think Ben kind of spoke to this as well, about kind of looking at prevention well in advance prior to the outbreak of atrocity violence. At some point, and this is tricky, but at some point you're really just talking about peace building. And we need to think more actively about how to connect atrocity prevention into all these other aspects of peace building, which are very, very well established in terms of practice and scholarship. We can think of connections, for instance, to transitional justice. And you've spoken, a number of you have spoken about transitional justice having a preventive aspect and not only a back, getting it's very exciting. Anyway, I'm onto something. I'll be here all week. So those are my points.
Thank you.
Oh, you got your own mic.
Yeah, I'm really taken with the idea, Carrie, of just thinking about how putting out another risk list could be a problem or detrimental to the field. And so I'm kind of curious about how, like, what would a totally different list look like? Like, what would an atrocity prevention list look like? Prevention. And that gets me, I'm thinking back to US government days where we would think about we'd not only look at the risk list, but then we'd look at where is the US government's opportunity for impact. And so it was a whole different level of analysis of like, where can a specific actor act? And so again, we haven't spoken a lot about that, but I'm curious about how we could upend the kind of risk list and think about it from a totally, just like, put the prevention on top and the risk on the bottom. And then also, just because of all of the different questions that come in every time we talk about this, like, can you make these models really simple and easy to explain to people that want to take them and do work in a systematic way, but like are not going to do it this way? Because but like they want to do a little bit of quantitative work and a little qualitative. I would love there to be a little bit of like teaching and education that comes out along with the framework so that people can take their particular issue and do something real with it. Because I feel like there's like everyone in this room can be a part of it, and just like not making it seem like only Ben and Ernesto and Holly can do the work, but like we all have a piece and we all have a role, and like make it more accessible. Thanks.
That's a comment.
Thank you so much. This is all really great. And all I have to say is stay tuned. There will be more information to come, and you'll all be invited for the next stage of this. So please join me in thanking everyone.